You know, coming out here today, or thinking about being out here tonight, reminded me of one afternoon when I walked out on my porch at my house, and there was a hot air balloon breaking through the clouds right above my home. And the guy in the balloon called down and said, "Where am I?" And I said, "Well, you're 200 feet in the air." And he said, "Well, you must be a circuit court judge." And I said, "Yeah, how'd you know that?" He said, "Because everything you said is completely correct, but totally useless." I kind of feel like what I'm here to say, I'm going to try to make it as accurate as I can. And I hope there'll be something about it that you'll find to be useful. But this is a really fun subject for me. I got interested in the Civil War. I guess when I was a kid, my dad was interested in it, and so I adopted that at a very early age. There came a time in my sort of adult life that I wanted to try to trace the travels of the Union soldiers as they came through DeKalb County on the way to Chickamauga. And so in my reading and my research and my effort to find those sites along the way where the soldiers had camped and what happened as they traveled through here, I became really interested in the human interest side of that experience that they had back in 1863. And so it is from a human interest point of view that I want to talk to you more so than a military. This is not a military history as such. This is a little bit of a human interest story about how the soldiers experienced DeKalb County and how the people of DeKalb County experienced the soldiers, how they interacted, what they did, and how they related to each other for that short period of time that those soldiers were here. I got a little bit of a tour of the facility out here earlier. Kelly was nice enough to show me around. I'm so impressed with what you have here. It's just wonderful. I'm quite taken by this and impressed by it. And I congratulate you on it. And Paul Dale, where's Paul? I see you back there, Paul. You know, I keep getting great feedback from a lot of people about your work here and the leadership in the community and all that it takes for the citizens of our area to make this happen. So my hat's off to you. Congratulations for what you've accomplished. I want to take you back to the summer of 1863. So travel with me, if you will, in your mind at least, back to 1863, when the north side of the Tennessee River was occupied primarily by Union forces. They were under the command of General William Rosecrans, and his Union Army of the Cumberland was taking, I guess you'd say, a bit of a rest after having fought, had hard-fought combat throughout Middle Tennessee. On the opposite side of the river, on the south side of the Tennessee River, there were Confederate forces, not nearly by anywhere close to the same numbers that there were of Union forces on the north side of the river, but there were scattered pickets all across the Tennessee River on the south side. I think they all knew that eventually there was going to be combat between those two opposing forces. But during that sort of lazy days of late August of 1863, things were kind of at a standstill. There was a sort of an unspoken bit of a peace, and it was written by, in the regimental history of the Ohio Volunteer Cavalry, that some of the Union boys took a skiff and rowed across to pay the Johnnies, that's the Confederates, a visit and trade coffee for tobacco. Two of the Johnnies came over to the Union side to take breakfast. So you had men from the opposing forces that came back and forth across the Tennessee River to visit with each other, enjoy a cigar, a cup of coffee, and to take breakfast together. But those things changed in late August of 1863. General Rosecrans, the Union commander of the Army of the Cumberland, had almost 62,000 soldiers under his command. Now, those 62,000 soldiers were not all lined up on the banks of the Tennessee River. They were scattered up and down the Tennessee River throughout Tennessee and Jackson County. But one of those units of his command was the 20th Army Corps. The 20th Army Corps, under direction by General Rosecrans, was ordered to move across the river at Caperton Ferry on the way to Valley Head and across the mountain toward what became the Battle of Chickamauga. There were approximately 14,222 infantry and with 54 cannons, and there were approximately 10,000 cavalrymen and officers with 9 cannons. They had to figure out a way to get across the Tennessee River with all those men and that equipment and that armament, and up the mountain and across Sand Mountain to get to Valley Head, and from Valley Head to get on across Lookout Mountain. Now, Caperton Ferry and the Caperton Ferry Road is what you and I today know as Highway 117. At Stevenson, where the highway crosses the Tennessee River, where Highway 117 crosses the Tennessee River, that's where the Caperton Ferry was. So, in preparation for their movement of all these men and all the livestock and cannons and equipment that they had, they were to lay down 59 pontoons across the river to make a bridge across the river there. Now, these pontoons were really like large canoes that were pointed up and down the river, not across the river, but they were laid side by side, or about 14 or 15 feet apart. And then there was planking put across those pontoons to make a bridge for the soldiers and the livestock and the equipment to cross. There were 25 soldiers and 1 officer in each of the pontoons to give them stability in the river current. Unfortunately, the pontoons were not all that successful in getting that number of men and all that equipment across the river, and so General Philip Sheridan of the Union was ordered to build 2 needed bridges at Bridgeport. Now, Sheridan sent 1,500 men into the woods. This was on the Jackson County side of the river, of course, into the woods to cut the timbers to build those bridges. And within a day, those men had delivered back to the river's edge 1,500 logs suitable for the building of a trestle bridge at Bridgeport. The work that was done by Sheridan was really quite remarkable, a major engineering feat in my judgment. But unfortunately, while the effort to get all the men and equipment across the river at Caverton Ferry was proceeding and the trestle bridge was being built, the trestle collapsed. And so there were some men who had made it across the river and some who had not. There were Sheridan, by the way, in his own autobiography, fails to mention that the bridge that he was responsible for collapsed. He merely says in his autobiography that their effort to cross the river was, quote, delayed somewhat. But the Union forces, because of that collapse, did straddle the Tennessee River. There were some that made it across, some that were delayed. Those that made it across may not have, the wagons and the support and supplies for them may not have made it across. And so some of them were a bit marooned on the east side or south side of the river. And they lacked their blankets and their rations and their supplies. But once they got across, once all of these soldiers and all of the equipment and all of the livestock that supported them got across the river, then their next obstacle was to get up the mountain. How were they going to get all of that up the mountain? There's a great book, I have it here with me tonight. This Terrible Sound is the name of it. It was written by Peter Cousins, and it's one of the early works and one of the better known studies about the Battle of Chickamauga. And he wrote this about the scaling of Sand Mountain. He described it as a nightmare of unremitting toil, and blazing heat, and ankle-deep dust. He wrote, wagons slipped and tumbled down the rocky slopes, killing mules and scattering supplies. It took 12 horses to pull a single cannon up the slope. Now, the records that I've read indicate that the 20th Army Corps had 750 wagons. Now, this is approximately 24,000 men. 14,000 infantry, 10,000 cavalry. They had 750 wagons. They had 100 ambulances. They had, according to what I've read, they had 4,500 mules. They had 200 horses. Even with all of the mules and the horsepower that they had to get their wagons up the mountain, they still had to use manpower to accomplish that feat. In fact, one of the sergeants from an Illinois regiment referred to themselves as assistant mules. Once they got to the top of the mountain, I think we've all been on Highway 117, Highway 35, where it crests the mountain just looking down on the Tennessee River. And you know what a beautiful view that is, looking out onto the Tennessee River there. Well, that view, as we know it today, reminds me a bit of what was described by one of the soldiers from Indiana. You don't think about soldiers at that stage in our history being quite so eloquent, but he wrote of the panorama that he described as breathtaking. And he said this, that he's looking from the top of the mountain back out at the river, and he said, below was a smiling valley with its fields of waving grain, while like a silver thread the Tennessee River wound between the high mountains, decked with the brightest foliage, and the bosom of the river was dotted with lovely islands, robed in green. In the distance, the pontoon bridges could be seen with a steady stream of bluecoats marching over them, their bayonets flashing back the sunlight, and the stars and stripes waving over them. In a book that I also have here, River of Death by William Robertson, he wrote that one of the Kansas regiments reached the summit of the mountain and observed this. The panorama which spread before them was breathtaking. From their perch 900 feet above the valley, the placid Tennessee River stretched like a silver ribbon across their front. On the river, a swarm of pontoon boats looked like tiny water bugs as the Pioneer Brigade assembled them into a frail bridge. The darkness fell, bonfires blazed on each end of the bridge, and on one end of the bridge, there was a soldier who recalled in his diary, the fires threw a faint glow over the fires threw a faint glare over the smooth current, revealing the long, low bridge with the hobgoblin forms of the troops bobbing up and down. So you can imagine with those descriptions what it must have been to see those pontoon bridges and the efforts to move the men across the river on those bobbing bridges, the cattle and all that went with them to support those troops. One of the men from an Ohio infantry did record in his records that he clutched tightly 6 quarts of commissary whiskey, which he had purchased in Stevenson for $1. I sent that passage from the book to the judge in Jackson County, who's a friend of mine, and he sent back an email that said some things just never change. Well, as the men of the 20th Army Corps moved across Sand Mountain, they headed for Valley Head. But they were saddened by the living conditions that they encountered. An officer from the 15th Kentucky wrote the following: the old men and women remain. Consequently, they are unable to cultivate very much this season. They are deprived of the greater portion of what they did raise. Their mothers and daughters of once respectable families sacrificed their honor for a few dollars to enable them to sustain life. There was an officer in the Union forces named Hans Christian Haig from Wisconsin, and he wrote to his wife from Valley Head. And he said, the people here are suffering by the rebels. Men, women, and children have been shot and hung by the hundreds. I've never felt so glad to be a soldier as I have since I came into these mountains, where we could do so much good to the poor downtrodden people. There are hundreds here that have laid in hollow logs and caves for months, hiding themselves, and their women have been hung till they were compelled to tell where their husbands were. One woman came into camp yesterday whose husband had been shot a few weeks ago after he had been compelled to dig his own grave. In another letter home, Colonel Haig described a woman and her 6 children who were, quote, almost dead from hunger and consumption. He gave them flour and sugar. About 2 weeks later, Colonel Haig was killed at Chickamauga. I want you to imagine for just a minute being one of those poor souls living in the heat and the drought and the poverty and the isolation of Sand Mountain in 1863. In the face of those hardships, imagine, if you can, the sight and the sound of thousands of men on foot and on horseback and in wagons, winding their way across Sand Mountain over the course of 3 or 4 days. Those soldiers were accompanied by hundreds of mule-drawn supply wagons, hundreds, if not thousands, of driven cattle. They were followed by merchants called sutlers, who came behind to sell everything from canned fruit to shoes. One of the soldiers who crossed through our part of the world was Lieutenant Chesley Mosman of the 59th Illinois Volunteer Infantry Regiment. Terry Hutchison mentioned this book earlier, and it also is, and I think your library has this, The Rough Side of War. It's a diary that was written by Mosman as he came through our area, and I recommend it to any of you who are interested in learning more about what they experienced as they came through here. But he said, he wrote of the women that were encountered as they moved through this area. He said they are doubtless badly frightened at finding themselves so surrounded by legions of men. The sight and the sound of the Federal forces must have caused fear and trembling as the Union Army advanced across Sand Mountain by the thousands. In Mosman's diary, he wrote that after scaling Sand Mountain, he said this: we went on to open timber, chestnut and pine. Now, I want you to remember the word chestnut for a minute. We came to open timber, chestnut and pine. There had been a hurricane across the mountain, and many trees were torn up by the roots. Now, the hurricane damage that Mosman described reminds me of the tornado damage experienced near the Chestnut Grove Baptist Church on Sand Mountain. If any of you travel Highway 117 across DeKalb County into Jackson County, you pass the Chestnut Grove Baptist Church. Just after you cross Town Creek, on the high ground past the creek, is the Chestnut Grove Church. The Chestnut Grove Baptist Church was founded 2 years before these soldiers came through that area. So when I read about the soldiers coming across Sand Mountain and encountering the chestnut trees and what Mosman referred to as a nearby splendid water source, I thought of the Chestnut Grove Baptist Church. And so one day I stopped at the general store out there. This has been years ago. There was a little general store out there operated by Mr. Thompson. I don't remember Mr. Thompson's first name, but he lived in the area. And I asked him if he'd ever heard about any movement of Civil War soldiers through the area. And he said, oh yeah, they camped right here down by the creek down there. And so, with permission of the landowner, I went down by the creek there near the Chestnut Grove Baptist Church and indeed found where the soldiers had camped back in 1863. Now, today there's a historical marker there in front of the church. A man at the church named Charles Bass came to my office one day, this is years ago. He knew that I'd been interested in this subject, and he came and he said that he wanted to try to have a historical marker erected, commemorating the movement of forces on the road to Chickamauga, the Caperton Ferry Road, which came right in front of the Chestnut Grove Baptist Church, Highway 117 today. And I said, well, Charles, you'll never be able to get a marker. How are you going to fund buying that? I just kind of sent him away. I said, I'll give you all my material. I got all kinds of stuff, you know, and I've collected over the years materials that I've copied off the internet and other places. And so I just gave it all to him. So when you get through reading all this, bring it back to me, but keep it as long as you like. And so several weeks later, he brought it back. And then fast forward about 2 years. He came to my office one day and he said, I want you to come speak at our dedication. And I said, well, what dedication are you talking about? He said, we got the historical marker. And so it's there today. And I encourage you to stop and look at it. It's right in front of the church. It's a little hard to find. The sign is out on Highway 117. It says historical marker. And if you turned right there at the sign, you'd go in somebody's driveway. So it's not right at the marker, or not right at that sign. You have to go a little bit further and then turn into the kind of a curved drive that goes in front of the church. And the marker is there at the church. Now, the 20th Army Corps commander was General Alexander McCook. Now, he traveled with his wife. And one of his division commanders was General Jefferson C. Davis. What a coincidence. This is a Union general by the name of Jefferson C. Davis. And he also traveled with his wife. I don't know for certain which of these two made their headquarters at the Winston House. I think it was probably Davis. It may have been McCook. It may have been both. And it may have been that their wives stayed at the Winston House and that these officers stayed with their men. I really can't answer that question, but we know that they arrived in Valley Head and that they made a headquarters there at the Winston Plantation. That is not, there were so many soldiers and there was so much equipment and so many wagons and so many driven cattle and so many mules and horses that were required to move these forces, but they couldn't all be at one place. They were stretched from, if you know where Allen Switch, does anybody know Allen? You know where Allen Switch is at? The Allen Plantation was property that was during our lifetime owned by the Stanley family. Today, you would know that as Volcraft. They were Volcraft. Yeah, Herbert Stanley's property. They also were, and they stretched from, well, even a little south of the Stanley property down to the Carden Farm. The Carden Farm is today owned by the city of Fort Payne and was bought by the city of Fort Payne with plans to turn it into a sports complex that apparently is on hold right now, but it's still owned by the city of Fort Payne. And it's a beautiful, or was a beautiful place until the city bulldozers got in there and moved everything around. Nevertheless, is the site from about Bailey Bridges. Is it Bailey Bridges? I guess is right there at on the railroad. Yeah, it used to be Wheeling, right there on the railroad track. Well, right behind the old Wheeling plant, now Bailey, all the way up to Wade Gap. There were soldiers all through that area. And then some, of course, there at the Winston plantation, at the Winston house. And then there were also a lot of soldiers that made their encampment at the Warmer house on Wills Creek. Now that's on the Warmer house, I think, is the oldest standing home in DeKalb County, I think. I could certainly be wrong about that, and I'm sure there are people here who have more information about that than I do, but that house is on that Wade Gap Road. It goes from the Valley Head Road across to Highway 11, and the area today is known as the Highland Subdivision. If any of you know where, maybe I shouldn't use his name, but David Dodd lives in that area. Those lawyers who are here know David, of course, and but there are a lot of people that live in that area now that where these soldiers camped at that time. It's referred to in some of the Confederate records as an encampment at Whitehall. And Whitehall Church is very close to the Highland Subdivision. So, that's kind of how they were scattered out once they got to the valley. From Long Spring, which is the water source for Valley Head, all the way down to, actually they went all, some of the soldiers actually at least made some incursions all the way down to Rollinsville and also all the way down to Lebanon. Rollinsville is there at what is the DeSoto Golf Course. And there's a marker there in front of the house where some of the soldiers went while they were in the county. So now, when we talk about the Civil War in DeKalb County, we typically don't think about much combat. Actually, the records have quite a few references to violence committed between Union and Confederate forces while they were here. It was usually very scattered and very brief. And I'm not going to try to read excerpts from all those records. I've got some of them here that if you want to look at later, you can. But there were, in fact, some encounters that resulted in the loss of life while the soldiers were in our county. But one of the things that I think that all of us who've been in the service, and certainly those who've been in combat, can attest to, is that military service is not constant combat. And wars are fought by young men and young women now, but back then, young men. And men are going to be boys no matter what generation it is, whether it's during the Civil War or whether it's now. Young boys, young men, they're going to engage in some horseplay and some practical jokes on each other. So the records also not only include examples of some of the violence that they experienced while they were here, but also some of the pleasurable things that they encountered while they were here. The soldiers camped at DeSoto Falls. And while they were camped at DeSoto Falls, Bozeman recorded in his diary, that some of the boys pushed boulders off the cliffs to watch them crash to the water below. Some of them went down to the pool below the falls to swim, and others stayed on the cliff to throw apples at their buddies below. Bozeman built a raft out of the slabs that had washed over the falls from Ellison's sawmill upriver. Now keep in mind that the dam that we know today wasn't there in 1863. But there was a dam. The dam was upriver by, I don't know what, a quarter of a mile?
About right. You can still see it.
Pardon?
When the water's clear, you can
Still see it, that's right. You sure can. That's right. If you go when the water's low, you can still see some of the foundations of that old dam site. And there was a mill there called Ellison Sawmill. Well, that's what Bozeman refers to when he says that he built a raft out of slabs from the sawmill from Ellison's dam up the river. Well, I brought a picture for you. I'm going to pass it around. Some of you have probably seen these. Some of you may know a lot more about this than I do. But I bought one of these at a yard sale. And I frankly don't know where I bought the postcard, but the postcard also shows Ellison's mill. But this is also an old photograph of Ellison's mill, which I think must look very much like it did in 1863. And I'll pass it around and let you all look at it. I think you'll find that of some interest. The soldiers that camped at DeSoto Falls camped on land that at one time was owned by Dr. Clarence Sapp. Some of you knew Dr. Sapp, I'm sure. And I have a story to tell about that I laugh about a little bit now, but it wasn't funny at the time. The Sapps owned 112 acres or so, whatever it was, near Nippersink Lodge. And I had been close friends with Ed and Jerry Disney, who owned Nippersink Lodge. And I loved the Disneys and had been reading about the soldiers being at DeSoto Falls. And so I called Ed Disney one Sunday afternoon. I never will forget this. Sunday afternoon, I called him and told him I'd like to come hunt with a metal detector behind Nippersink and see if I could find any evidence that soldiers were there. He said, oh, that's fine. Yeah, come on. So a friend and I went out there on a Sunday afternoon, and I'm in the woods and sort of just lost, in what I'm doing, paying attention to, trying to listen to this metal detector. And this man walks up to me in the woods and he says, what do you think you're doing? And I said, well, I'm trying to determine whether there was any Civil War activity in this area. And he said, well, I own this land and you don't have permission to be here. And I said, well, Mr. Disney said it would be okay. He said, well, Mr. Disney doesn't own this. It was Dr. Sapp. Dr. Sapp. So I excused myself and I left. And I wrote him a letter to apologize because I hadn't checked the title I really didn't know where the property line was, but I thought I don't know why I thought, but I did think that the Disney's owned the land. And so I wrote him a nice letter and never heard from him and never thought much more about it. Well, fast forward from that, I don't remember now whether it was a year or two later. I was at a social event in Mentone at Christmas, and this attractive older woman came up to me and she said, "Are you Judge Raines?" Of course, that's not good. that's never. But yes, ma'am, I am. She said, "My husband was Clarence Sapp, and he died." And she said, "I found on his desk your letter." And she said, "If you ever want to come back, you come anytime you please. And you make yourself at home out there as often as you like. And you look for your Civil War stuff and make yourself at home." So over a period of time, Hilda and I became friends. We went to have dinner at her home. And, just really had a fondness for her, and my wife had a fondness for Hilda. And got to know her that way. But we found a few things out there. One day she called me and she said, "I have sold the property, or I have somebody that's going to buy it." I don't think, well, she hadn't sold it at that point. She said, "I have a prospect, a buyer, and I think if you're going to hunt for Civil War artifacts anymore, you probably ought to come on and kind of wind it up." So I went back maybe a couple of times after that. And what I want to show you is something I found at DeSoto Falls on her property with her permission. These are, I guess this is maybe the last time I was ever there. But I really cherish this, and mainly because it's DeSoto Falls and DeKalb County, but also because it was Hilda and how sweet she was to me and my wife. So I'll pass this around too. Feel free to pass it on back and take a look at it. And that is the brass piece that's in the center of that is called a breastplate. And the Union soldiers often wore a knapsack or a backpack that had cross straps, and this eagle breastplate would sort of pin those two straps in place. And a lot of times the soldiers considered that a bullseye, that if they were in combat, it was just what the opposing force was going to aim at. And so a lot of soldiers threw those things away. They're really not very valuable. I mean, they're cheap. You can buy them at antique stores, and Civil War shows all the time, because there's so many of them that soldiers just discarded and threw away. But that one came from DeSoto Falls, and so for me, that was pretty special. And I'm certainly pleased to have it. The bullets also came from that same property. Now, in talking about the boys being boys, I want to tell you about an occasion when they enjoyed some brandy from a local distillery. One of the soldiers wrote this: on top of the mountain, we found a large and well-cultivated plantation with a peach orchard of about 10 acres. Some of the boys made a reconnaissance and discovered a still house where the old planter was engaged in the very laudable business of manufacturing peach brandy. It soon became evident to the officers from the number of canteens that were being filled that there was some kind of liquid on that plantation more attractive than spring water or sorghum molasses. As soon as the boys were becoming boisterous and unmanageable, the general declared that the best thing to do was to move out. The brigade started, and I think I am safe in saying that fully half the horses were without riders. We all got to the foot of the mountain by morning, and those that could not ride down or walk down just fell down. After crossing Sand Mountain and Lookout Mountain, the soldiers went off of Lookout Mountain at Henderson's Gap, which that's not a well-known landmark. Actually, they went off the mountain because there were so many of them. They went off at 2 or 3 locations, but Henderson Gap is the one that I find most often mentioned in the records that I've read. And I've walked Henderson's Gap from the top of the mountain all the way to the bottom and back up again. The old roadbed's still there. And it's really a beautiful sight to see.
Where is that, Judge?
Well, it's about, if you turn at Cloudland and go south about 2 miles, it's on private property, of course. And I have a friend who owns the land there. He and I have lunch together about once a month. It's an interesting place to see. It really is beautiful. And of course, off the mountain, not far into the valley there is Alpine, Georgia. Union forces, Confederate forces under the command of General Joe Wheeler were in that area, and there were some engagements there between the Union and Confederate forces in the area of Alpine, Georgia. And when you read about Alpine, a lot of people immediately think of Alpine that we have out here. That's not the Alpine that's mentioned in the records. In fact, somebody locally was talking to me about Alpine, Georgia just recently, that they've been there to visit and seen the old church that's still there.
We had.
Well, I guess it was you that was talking about that. Yeah, maybe it was your wife that mentioned it. Yeah. And it's a beautiful little area, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
It really is. It's easy to get to if you go to Menlo and turn, I don't know what the road number is, but turn south.
Jamestown Road or?
No,
Stop
not the Jamestown Road.
Four-way stop.
Yeah.
And where is it down there?
It's not far, a few miles. That takes you down there. Anyway, after the 20th Army Corps, or certainly some of the lead of the 20th Army Corps got to Alpine, Georgia, they got orders to retrace their steps, come back up the mountain to try to join forces with the 14th Army Corps. Now, Rosecrans, who was the commanding general of the Army of the Cumberland, had 3 corps under him. He had 60,000 plus men under him. What we've talked about coming through here is 20 to 24,000, but there was another 40,000 men that were under the command of General Rosecrans. One of those was the 14th Army Corps, which was under the command of George Thomas, the Rock of Chickamauga. All of you have heard of him, of course. And so when McCook had to bring his men back up the mountain, back to try to join forces with the 14th Army Corps, that delayed their movement and must have exhausted them. By the time they got to the actual Battle of Chickamauga, I cannot imagine how exhausted they must have all been. Beginning in on September the 19th of 1863, there were 125,000 Americans, approximately 60,000 Union, approximately 63 to 66,000 Confederates, who fought to control the supply routes between Chattanooga and Atlanta. It's 125,000 men that fought at the Battle of Chickamauga. One of the Alabama soldiers said this and described the fighting of the 19th as, quote, one solid, unbroken wave of awe-inspiring sound, as if all the fires of earth and hell had been turned loose in one mighty effort to destroy each other. And so, by the end of the day, on September 20th, 1863, almost 35,000 Americans lay dead, wounded, or missing at Chickamauga, the bloodiest battle, the bloodiest two-day battle of the Civil War. So thank you for letting me talk to you a little bit about the experiences of the soldiers as they came through DeKalb County, that important stop they made in Valley Head, and in the valley, up and down the valley, and in Mentone, and across both the east fork of the river and the west fork of the river. They crossed, by the way, I didn't say this, they crossed the west fork of the river, of course, there at DeSoto Falls, right there at Ellison's Dam, and they crossed the east fork of the river at what is known as Flatland Ford. There is a record, and I've looked for it, and I can't find it again, but my memory tells me that there's a record that says that they crossed the river and went into camp at the flat land. And maybe that is the way that got its name as the Flatland Ford. In any case, it's known as Flatland Ford today. Back when I was so interested in trying to trace all the movements and where all these campsites were, one of the people that I called had built a house down, or owned a lot down there. I don't think he'd actually built a house at this time. He was a doctor in Birmingham. I was always very careful, tried to be very careful about getting permission to go wherever I went. And so I called this doctor to ask him if I could hunt with a metal detector on his property, and the nurse or receptionist said, well, he'd have to call me back. And I said, well, that'll be fine. I just want to talk to him about a possible Civil War encampment on his property. He picked up the phone just like that. It didn't take him 10 seconds to pick up the phone. So if you ever need to talk to a doctor, then you want to talk about the Civil War. So anyway, he and I also had a nice relationship. He came to my office a couple of times to see me. He gave me permission to hunt at his property. And one of the things I found there at his property, at Flatland Ford, was a Burnside bullet, which was a rather advanced piece of ammunition for that time. Burnside was a repeating rifle. Had a cigar-shaped bullet, and I found an entire, they're almost paper thin. They're incredible that one still existed that has been there for 150 years, whatever it was at the time. And I found one there which was a pretty advanced piece of ammunition for that era. But also there, I found 2 or 3 .69 caliber bullets. Now, those of you who've been in the military, if you think about how big a .69 caliber bullet is, I mean, it's the size of your thumb. That was a pretty primitive piece of equipment or ammunition. The single shot musket rifles that fired .69 caliber bullets were heavy and long. The bullets themselves are not very manageable because they're so big and so heavy. And so it's interesting to me that we had these forces, Union forces, that had not only some of the most advanced armament at that time, but also some of the most primitive at the time. And they were all apparently in the same unit moving across our area. I suppose it is possible that there were some Confederate soldiers. The Confederates often had the .69 caliber bullets because they didn't have nearly as many advanced weapons as the Union forces did. So it is possible that on that same site there had been some Confederate soldiers encamped at some time that had dropped those .69 caliber bullets. I'll never know. You'll never know. And we can always speculate about that, I suppose. But anyway, I thank you for letting me be here. Thank you so much for what you've done for this wonderful facility, for Mentone, and for preserving the history of this area. Thanks.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
Have you ever hunted on our property? Charlie and I own Gibson's Farm in Valley Head.
I've never.
Well, we found a hub and a spoke to what we think is a cavalry wagon. Will's Creek runs through our property.
I know exactly where you're talking
Yeah,
about. Yeah.
and we don't even have a metal detector. Literally sticking out
I've
of the
got
creek.
one. Yeah, no, I've never been there. I know that area, and I've always thought that might. There were some things found. I have found a few things in Valley Head. I've never hunted on the Winston property. They would never allow us to hunt there.
What about Oak Lawn? Have you been to Oak Lawn?
No, I've never hunted at Oak Lawn either.
You need to come to Valley Head.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. There are bound to be some other places in Valley Head that need to be searched.
Yeah.
But there have been a lot of people that have done this. You know, this hobby is not
Yeah.
something that's new. I mean, you know, I guess I've done this at least 25 years.
And you know, next year is the big reenactment at Battle of Chickamauga. Did you know that?
Well, no, I didn't know that there was going to be a big reenactment next
We
year.
were recently in Kentucky and went on a tour of the Perrysville battleground,
Mhm.
and the guy there is a retired attorney, ironic, and he's huge into all the battles and this for miles around, and he informed us that the Battle of Chickamauga will be reenacted. I think it's the 170th. Yeah, next September.
That'd be fun.
Yeah.
That'd be fun.
I doubt it's gonna be reenacted there.
It probably won't be on
There's
the
a
property.
prohibition against that kind of stuff.
Oh.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
We all know that the loyalties up here of the locals divide. It kind of went both ways.
Right.
Do you know anything about some of the local young men who fought in one unit or the other
I don't.
here?
I do not. I don't have any information about that. But you're right, and I mean, that's true not only here, but that's true countywide, and maybe even Northeast Alabama had divided loyalties. My great-great-grandfather was in the Confederate cavalry. His brother was a Union sergeant. So they are buried next to each other. One has a Confederate marker, one has a Union marker. Yeah. They're the same family.
A little clarification, you described the hardships that the Union troops experienced. I thought the Southern women were experiencing. Was that because some of the, Southerners were being constricted by, so, people trying to make them come in the Confederate Army. Is that why they were suffering?
That's what I think, yes. I don't know the answer to that question, and frankly, when I read that material that I read to you earlier, from Colonel Haig's letter, where he talked about hundreds. There are hundreds here that have laid in hollow log and caves for months, hiding themselves, and their women have been hung till they were compelled to tell where they're.
Home guard.
All I'm telling you is that's what his letter said. Is that true? Did it happen? I don't know.
If I can jump in just a minute, of course, I'm talking too. When I say that, I don't have a problem talking, but that from what I have found out is more true than what you would generally think. There were conscription officers that come up out of Talladega County and whatnot. You had Montgomery Davenport's company that joined in with them from down in the valley here up on Sand Mountain. They would come up there, and from some of the papers that those men had left where they were applying for pension and whatnot, that stuff was mentioned that they had to stay hid out, until the time that the Union armies came across. And many of them joined the Union Army at that time, but they didn't want to be conscripted into the Confederate Army. They didn't, I don't know what their loyalties were. I don't know what they were thinking. I don't know what their thoughts were, and I'm not trying to say what they were. But the one thing that's documented, I guess you would say, is that they hid out to keep from having to go into the Confederate Army, where they would probably be sent to Virginia or somewhere, and they just didn't want to, for whatever reason. And it was so bad during that time in 1863 that when the Union Army came across, a lot of them joined in just to help police the Confederates from staying out. If that makes sense. And the reason I kind of know about, my great grandfather was one of them. My grandmother was interviewed in 1973 for a book that was written by a teacher over on Sand Mountain. It's called Trailing Smokes. It's the name of the book. And she was ancient then in 1973. But her father, she was very young when her father died. He had started a second family, and she was one of his last natural born children. But the tale was told to her, I'm sure, from her mother, that he stayed hid out. One of the things that said the night he slept the warmest was when it snowed and covered him up in the brush pile. Stories like that that were passed down, you can kind of go back and find documentation of it later, or at least where it's written down and something, recorded information.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
The crossing of the Tennessee River there, at the time the river wasn't dammed, you think the river was at that part as wide as it is now?
No.
So it would have been a much smaller.
One of the records refers to it as 1,250 feet.
12.
Yeah. I'm sure it varied from place to place, but there at Caperton, I think was about 1,250. I might be able to find that in the record if you really interested.
How long that was.
Yeah. But it varied. Yes, ma'am.
What about the movement of troops from Alpine, Alabama, up toward DeSoto Falls? You know anything about that movement?
I don't know of any troops being in Alpine, Alabama.
Okay. There are rumors that there were, and were moved up along the river and then.
I don't know anything about that, I wonder whether that might be just, somebody's speculation that Alpine was Alpine, Alabama rather than Alpine, Georgia. I don't know.
Looking at a map, sometimes it seems like they would have come from the falls through the Alpine area to Alpine, Georgia, following those roads,
Well, they went
actually to the east fork. On that area.
Well, they went from DeSoto Falls. Now, I'm sure, maybe I don't understand what you're saying.
No, it doesn't make sense. Maybe it was the road that was.
They went from-
road that connected.
They went from DeSoto Falls across the river, to Flatland Ford, and I don't know, there's a road number there at Flatland Ford now. I don't even know what the road number is.
I think it's the end of 633.
633. It goes down
Goes down to Flatland?
to Dr. Money's house.
Yeah,
That's 633 off of 106.
okay. You live out there?
No, but I live down there.
Yeah. My law partner, when I was practicing law, owned some property down there. And I used to go out there with him way before I got interested in the Civil War, doing this, looking for stuff. And there are metal rings, or there were back then, that had been hammered into the rocks at the edge of the river. And our speculation was that it was a crossing, and that was where they ran a chain through those rings in order to try to prevent the wagons from washing downriver and in high water. Of course, I don't know. That's just pure speculation on my part. I don't know if those rings are still there. Somebody might have gotten them, but they were there at one time. It's a beautiful area. Yes, sir.
Judge Ryan, my name is Greg Cole, and I and two or three other people in here live in a development called Day Spring Development, which is next door to Ronnie Jones Farm.
Yes, sir.
On 165. And ever since I've been there, and even on my old topo maps, there's a trail that goes from basically through Tutwiler Gap, came through where the golf course and ski slope are. And there's a ford below the covered bridge that we've always been told was part of that military trail. And there is a trail in the woods there. And so we're trying to figure out if it's true, all the rumors we've heard all these years, if a portion of these soldiers came through there. We don't know how many, but that trail is still in the woods. And I've been told there was a ford somewhere around this Ellison's middle, that there was a ford in the river there, and there's definitely one just above our property, which is below the covered bridge. And on that old topo map I have that dates from the 40s, it's called Old Military Road. And that roadbed comes out on 165 just north of Mentone Fire Department number 2 that's in our neighborhood. And I've been telling people for years that that is where a bunch of them came through. Do you think that that's true?
I think it might be that, and that goes over to Holly Springs Cemetery.
South of there.
This is, if you know where fire station, well,
Yeah,
I take that back. If you kept on going, it might go by Holly Springs.
yeah, well, yeah.
Yes.
There is a ford there in that, below the bridge, in the river. There's a definite cobblestone sort of ford.
Yeah.
Right there at the base of their neighborhood. There's a trail that runs kind of along the river and crosses there, and then it comes up the other side and runs up.
And it's across the river where it comes up, and I'm talking about, what I'm trying to connect is, the reason I think there may be some validity to that as a crossing for these soldiers is that I've never been able to quite figure out where they traveled to get to Flatland Ford. And one of the routes that, well, I guess I need to look at the map to rethink my route here, but anyway, I've always thought that there might be a way that they crossed near the mountain near the Holly Springs Cemetery.
It would be. If you look on a map, it's almost due east from, you get down to the river where they cross, either DeSoto Falls or, along in that area below there. It's almost due east over to where you're talking about. And I wanted to ask you while I've got the floor, is it true that I've heard that when they crossed the East Fork, where you've done your research, I've always heard that they descended near the beginning of Laurelwood development, which is below Cloudland. There's a gap that Laurelwood housing development is in.
Yeah.
And is that true? Have I been told right that it's around Laurelwood?
Well, Henderson's Gap is near that.
Okay.
Now, Henderson, there's no question in my mind. I mean, I absolutely 100%. I've never found a single item at Henderson's Gap. But I know lots of people, not lots, but I know some people that have. And the man that owns that property has found stuff.
And how about, I've heard also that when they got to the bottom, it was around that Amy Cemetery. It's
I don't know where that is. I don't think.
it's up against the foot of the mountain. If you're going from Mentone to Menlo, before you get to the four-way stop, there's a road to the right that follows the foot of the mountain, and there's Amy Cemetery down there. And that's where I've heard they came through there before they went over to Alpine.
Well, now, I used to think that there are records that talk about them coming off Lookout Mountain at really several gaps.
Right.
There's Standifer Gap, there's Neal's Gap, there's Davis Gap, there's Henderson's Gap. All the records talk about the soldiers coming off the mountain at more than one place.
Right.
And at one time, I was absolutely convinced that there was a place they came off at Chesterfield. You know where Chesterfield is? Well, it's in Cherokee County, but we could take some maps and we could try to figure it out. And with your knowledge of the area, and a lot of you who have a lot more knowledge of the area than I do, we might be able to put together some theories about where it is, and then try to prove those theories true or false. You're welcome to take my metal detector. I've offered it to lots of people lots of times, and I had a couple that took it. A man and a wife, they took it and probably kept it 2 or 3 months one time. They never found anything, but they had fun with it.
Well, I rented Dorothy Crow's little cabin, and people in here would know who Dorothy Crow was before she died 4 or 5 years ago, and had one of 11 or 12 siblings, and in the Alpine, Alabama area.
Right.
And she told me that she was the youngest of 11 or 12, and she said her older brothers, this would have been in the 30s, would walk this trail that goes through our property. That's how you went to Valley Head. And it went through Tutwiler Gap, through Jack Jones's property, and that trail is still there in the woods. And she said that was the old military trail.
Now, that trail also comes out on Scenic Drive at about Cragsmere.
I don't know.
There's part of it that does.
It would come out kind of like where
Water
the
tower.
entrance
there's an upper trail,
Yeah.
and then if you take the trail up the golf course, that's a lower, you could come
Yeah.
up, go up,
You been to Polecat Cave?
yeah.
Okay, Hall.
Yeah, Polecat Hall.
But I will extend an invitation. I'm a neurotic about old roadbeds. It's a hobby of mine. And I would love to show you this trail. It actually is in Paul's front yard, about 150 feet from his front porch. And it's been there a long, long time. And we've always heard that it was. And I can't figure out if it's 10,000 guys marching through there, or if they're all spread through the woods, taking different routes. I don't know, but I would love to show you this trail.
Well, I'd love to see it. It'd be fun. We'll exchange information here in a few minutes and see if we can get together sometime. It'd be good. Well, there's a lot to be learned about this out here. I mean, I've just scratched the surface. I don't know, and that's one reason I was hesitant to come and talk, because I can't answer questions like your question. I don't know the answer to that. I don't know all the different routes that they took. Clearly, they could not have all, you couldn't move that many men and that many wagons and that many cattle. You can think how many cattle they had to move to feed their forces. It just couldn't. It wasn't a trail. It wasn't one a single trail. There were a lot of different places.
And from the Stanley place and that area, that could have taken Wade Gap.
Yeah.
And come on up through Alpine. I don't know exactly how those roads were there.
Well, I don't know either, but I agree with you about that. And at one time, I really thought that's what had happened, but I've never been able to document it. And I'm convinced that there are still, for those of you that are interested in relicing and trying to prove or disprove some of these theories, I'm convinced that there are still picket posts on the side of Lookout Mountain, because there's a record somewhere, and I've got all this stuff that I don't even know where I'd find it now, but I remember a record somewhere that one of the soldiers said that the campfires looked like stars in the night on the side of the mountain. Well, those were picket posts. I don't know where they were, and I've never found one of them. I looked for some of them, but I never found them.
Did you start metal detecting to find the places you were researching, or did you start researching to find places to metal detect? Or both?
Which came first, the chicken or the egg? Yeah. I just don't know that I can answer that question. The first time I ever went relic hunting, I've been interested. I had a friend who was into this stuff, and well, first time I ever went with him, I dug up an old iron bed. I mean, if you do this, you've got to be willing to have a lot of unsuccessful days looking for Civil War stuff.
Well, for me, that's why I just read books now. I quit
Yeah, I
trying to
mean, it's just the most frustrating thing. I mean, as many thousands of hours as I may have spent reading and thinking and walking and hunting and looking, there are just a small amount of time that I've ever come upon something. I will say, I told Kelly this on the phone one day when we talked recently, that when I was sitting on the bank of the town creek there at the Chestnut Grove Church, and I found that bullet, and I mean, it's almost a spiritual experience to think that that boy was probably killed a couple of days or a couple of weeks later. So it's been an interesting hobby.
I think we could probably stay here till midnight answering
I know,
your questions. I got one more and then y'all have to stop. Yankee Road, which comes out on,
Yeah.
on the west side near Sulphur Springs Gap.
Yeah.
And on the other side, it goes right into 157. That would seem to be a logical place. Because if you turn left on 157, you hit 136 going across the mountain from Trenton,
Right,
and that's Stevenson's Gap Road.
that's right.
And I know they went down there.
Yeah.
I just wondered, I mean, with a name like Yankee Road, hello.
Yeah, I don't think there's any question. I never have done any hunting up there. I don't know anybody up there, and I never have tried to get permission from anybody up there, so I've never done any of that. But yeah, I agree with you. That's probably, at one time, it was probably a fertile area. You know, there've been so many people that have adopted this hobby over the years. I mean, it's a big hobby, it was really big. A lot of people were into it. So I think that's probably been heavily hunted in that area, but I can't say for sure, I don't know. But I know what you're talking about. Yes, ma'am.
Well, if you're familiar with Highway 117 that goes up the mountain, and as you go up the mountain, it curves to go up, and there's a farm that sits right there in the valley. In the middle of that farm, many years ago, according to my grandfather, my great-grandfather, Pleasant Dallas Phillips, and my grandfather, Richard Phillips, and my father, Earl Phillips, these Yankees and the Confederates, it's a valley, and we all know what a ridge is in the mountain. Yankees would sit on the mountain, and the Southerners would sit on the ridge, and they would go down to the spring, and sometimes they would meet at the spring to get their water. But then when they weren't there, then they would have their skirmishes there. And I picked up several musket balls, lots of them that I found in the fields there. Plus the old road bed. If you'll see that brick house that sits up on the hill, there's a road bed that came down from the mountain, and it said that the soldiers came down that old road bed and would camp out on the hills to get their water. This is the old J.O. Blackburn farm is across the road, and if you're going up 117, after you pass over the interstate and start going up the mountain, it's that farm right in there. And in the middle of that farm was a big spring. When I say a big spring, it was at least, according to my dad, 8 to 10 feet in diameter. And the spring is still there, but it's been worked on.
I can add a footnote to that.
Say again.
I can add a footnote to that.
Okay.
You took me to that field we're talking about right there by Highway 17. Do you remember? Go.
Well, if you want to, yes, I did.
And
My father told you this all the
that's right.
time.
Earl, her parents were friends of mine.
But if you want to use your metal detector there in that field, you're welcome to.
Well, I thank you for that.
I found lots of muskets in there.
Yeah. I know exactly where you're talking about, and I know, and I remember your dad so fondly, and your parents, I know your parents so fondly. And we did find, they lived next to Lee Chapel, and there was a house, there was a burned out old mobile home, maybe a little further up the road and across the road.
Okay.
And we found a few bullets in the yard of that old burned out mobile home.
Well, did Dad take you up to the old road bed?
I don't remember.
Well, Dad wasn't able to at the time you were.
No.
I probably would have taken you, but Dad wasn't able to, that's right.
Yeah.
That's well.
It's been a long time. I mean, gosh. It's been a long time.
It's been a few years.
Yeah, it sure has. It's been a long time. So great to see all of you. So David Haynes back there, I tell you, he's a photographer. If you all don't know him, you need to know this guy. And I didn't know he lived out here now.
Raise your hand.
You got, look, this community has the richest culture that I know of. And what a wonderful gathering it is to see all of you together. He taught a class in photography and took I was a student of, one of two students that he had that day. And we went down in the canyon. He carried a box camera, just like Ansel Adams. I mean, he carried a box camera and a tripod, and we went down in the canyon and he took photographs, and he's a wonderful photographer. And anyway, you're lucky to have somebody like that out here, and all of you add to the richness of the area. And I'm glad to know all of you, to be part of it. So thank you, kept you long enough.
Thank you.